the rest of the world loves that we struggle because as the world's sole superpower, us yearning and failing at the one sport that everybody else is kind of born to thrive at, I think it's pretty well the one thing they kind of have over us right now.
And soccer, men's soccer, is the last frontier almost of underdogdom for us. And it'll be a shame to bring it to an end. What will we lose in that instance? But I bet it'll be worth it.
It's Rog, and I'm here with a very special human being, Brendan Hunt. It is gorgeous to see you.
It is an honor to be in your presence, good sir, and especially with the fantastic jacket you've selected for this moment, which I feel slightly shamed by, and I will try to correct at our next session.
Back at you, and when I look at you, I just think of that live truth, that reason is powerless in the expression of love.
Billy Shakes, man. He could turn a phrase.
Billy Shakes. Brendan, it is a joy to be with you for so many reasons, but you and I have so bloody much in common. We are both enormous Chicago sports fans. We both sincerely believe that the movie Victory is a work of true cinematographical genius.
Let's check and double check, yes.
We both revere Brene Brown. And we are both American gents who adore the football.
There's some kind of Freaky Friday, two guys pee in a pool, and they switch personalities, born in different places, but they're the same person. One of those movies. It writes itself, Raj.
Oh my God, Hollywood executives, pee in the pool 1, 2, and 3. It does write itself. You first entered my consciousness back in 2010 during the World Cup. Twitter had just become a football thing, and there were a hardy band of us, each like really just thriving, just dominating, just owning America with 200 followers each, and tweeting up a storm about football from a US perspective. What was your Twitter handle back then?
The Unlikely Fan, which had its roots in when I was working at Boom Chicago in Amsterdam, I think for the previous tournament, for Euro 2008, and maybe World Cup 2006, I had done like fledgling bits of internet football comedy, just trying to get ahead of that huge market. But I was too soon.
You created the wave on which we are now all surfing. I do remember your stuff, your blog, your tweets. You were passionate. You were well informed. You stood out immediately during that England 1, USA 1 group stage victory. That's when I think I first noticed you. I loved every single one of your tweets about Clint Dempsey. You had one about Landon Donovan. You wrote, if Landon Donovan transferred to Utrecht FC, he would finally realise his destiny as the bizarro Rick Smits. I've got to tell you, I lolled when I saw that tweet back in the day.
That's not bad.
No, it's great. It had 4 likes. It had 4 likes, Brendan Hunt, and it felt like I was one of them. And I remember liking it and being like, oh my God, there's a kindred American spirit who is thinking things that I think making me laugh from his own couch. How did you get into football, though? Because you may hail from the north side of Chicago, but you always say in every single possible interview that it was a long road for you to finally become what you are, your own words, a soccer missionary. How did it happen?
Yeah, so in the States, I was not into football at all. It just really never came up, except for the movie Victory, which, when my grandmother got Showtime, Victory was one of approximately 5 movies that they showed on heavy repeat, all of which are movies I came to love, perhaps beyond their actual modern merit, such as Victor Victoria, Beastmaster.
Oh, classic.
Oh my gosh, Beastmaster made a man of me. But I absolutely loved that movie. And, I wasn't aware that, Bobby Moore and Ozzy Ardiles were people of note. They were just the cool guys in this movie with the guy from Death Trap and Rocky. Yeah, so then not into football at all. I knew the Chicago Sting existed, and I could name some of their people, Pato Marhetic, Karl-Heinz Granitza, but I couldn't pick them out of a lineup. I just knew they existed. The 1990 World Cup, I think I knew about it, but passed me by. Then in 1994, of course, we hosted, and some stuff started to catch hold there, but not in a hardcore, contagious way just yet. It wasn't until I moved to Amsterdam in 1999, at a time when there was no broadband, there was no streaming, And so I could not follow what the Bulls were doing. But also Michael Jordan had just retired. So there was a more profound sports hole in my soul at that time. And football just came walking on in, and started watching a few games, and especially Holland games. Holland was very good at the time. And they were about to host Euro 2000. Man U were escalating irrevocably toward the treble, and I watched them. Then I became a fucking nut. I subscribed to 442 and World Soccer, and I believe there was a magazine called Total Football for a while as well. And what was great about those magazines was they not only had current events, but they would always have like a historical feature, like top 25 club sides of all time, and like you could fill in those, top 50 hard men of all time, and between those two things, now I know who Frank Varos are and who Claudio Gentile was. So thank you, magazines. Remember magazines? Oh, they were great. They had their moment. But from then on, it's been nonstop and only getting more and more steeped.
This is amazing. Essentially, you are there in Amsterdam, the town that Serginho Dest built, and you have this sporting urge as just a steak-eating American. You are cut off from all of those American sports you love, and football essentially just scratched your itch to some degree, your sporting itch, your competitive itch, your narrative itch. But the way you describe your learning curve, you're almost like Daryl Hannah, the mermaid in Splash, using 442 and Total Soccer as your way to learn the language, to learn the past and learn the history. And I love that because the idea for this series, you came on our Twitch during the Champions League last season and actually made a joke about Shakespeare, just a random Shakespeare joke as you do while you're watching the Champions League semi-final. And I can't remember what the joke was, but you immediately fired back at me. Do you remember what you fired back at me with?
Craig Shakespeare?
Yes, you came back at me. Honestly, if I had any hair, it would have blown off. A Craig Shakespeare gag, a pun you unleashed on the assistant coach / bagman to Sam Allardyce and Nigel Pearson. And it just blew my mind. Your knowledge, Brendan, your wonder, gleaned from the pages of English football magazines and just then on with your commitment and your passion. And I knew that, like me, in that moment from our Twitter interactions, that you are a gentleman who has lived and dreamed and yearned to see the game we both love, football, in the nation we love, America, on both the men's and women's side, truly thrive. We want a nation where the Craig Shakespeares and the Tony Hibberts of the world are household names. Brendan, we have cheered on great days. We have mourned on dark ones right together.
I want everyone in this country to know, well, at least sports fans here, to know those who have not yet found the light of soccer, and of course now there's more than ever, but even in 2002 there weren't that many, and it made me mad. I felt like I'd been lied to. It felt like everyone who said that soccer was maybe pamby and boring and diving, they were only partially right about those things, and and that every sport has its flaws, but soccer's merits far overwhelm its flaws, and there's something even more invigorating and addictive about it once you give a shit. So like the trick is we have to get people in this country to give a shit, and the thing people tend to give a shit about the most easily is their national team. So I'm licking my chops.
Brendan, the honest truth is they are giving a shit, or is it in the present tense they are shitting? I don't know what it is, one or the other, both probably. As human beings together, many of the listeners too who have ached when the men's game has thrived slightly and then fallen back in the shadows. I mean, I do feel we're living in a age almost of our dreams. The game is really thriving. We're about to hit a window between 2022, the Men's World Cup, and 2026, when that same tournament will be played on these very shores. It's going to be Canada, it's going to be Mexico, yes, but the United States will once again host World Cup football games, which will propel the sport to the next level. And while there are many Americans who have been fans for decades, the vast majority of new young fans who listen to our show and who are in their 20s didn't experience the Men's World Cups in the 90s and the 2000s that many of us take for granted. They never saw your McBrides, your prime Landon Donovan, and brace yourself, dear listeners, Pete Clint Dempsey. And what's fascinating, honestly, even interviewing so many of the players in Europe, and you've met many of them while you've been shooting Ted Lasso, your Gios, your Brendan Aronsons, most of the young players who are thriving over there, they look at Christian Pulisic as their role model and as an American pathfinder. They never saw many of the older guys play either. So this show is designed to try and dig into that a little bit. A series of conversations with you and me in which we revel in, blow through, relive men's World Cups we remember that were really definitive from 1990. We weren't at the 1950 World Cup, sadly, Brendan, were we?
Respect Joe Gaetjens.
Yes, huge shout out to Joe. And, I didn't get a visa in time for the 1930 World Cup, but we are going to go through 94, the darkness of 98, the unexpected human wonder of 2002, the damp squib of 2006, all the way through to the surprise, shock, the world victory in 2022. It's coming. Are you ready for this, Brendan?
I am, but a quick shout out because I'm disheartened to realize after what you just said, if all they know is Pulisic, who of course earned it, bless his heart, these kids today, they'll hear the name Joe Max Moore and they'll think the hyphen is after Max.
That is both abhorrent from a footballing and a punctuation perspective. I'm like doubly offended. Of course, Joe Max Moore, one of my favourite football players who I've said many times on this show, the Everton fans immediately clocked and started to call him Joe Max Less, one of my favourite football nicknames of all time. But this may sound like you and I just having a couple of beers in the pub as we laugh and love at the memory of the greats. But the goal is really to do something that we both want to do, which is to reinforce the truth that there is here in the United States a rich and proud history of football on the men's side in this nation. You just have to hear it, know it, to understand it. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. And at the same time, I mean, Brendan, the game has come so far so fast, right?
It's insane to think about how easy it is to watch soccer now in the U.S. And it's easier in the U.S. than in any other major country. I'm told it's certainly easier than it is in England because, I mean, I have to turn the TV off at 3 o'clock for one thing. But like now you can literally watch any game on some streaming service or another. And thinking back even just to the build up to, I think it was the 2002 World Cup, I realized suddenly that the the second leg of this might have been 2006 because they played each other both World Cups. The second leg of the playoff between Uruguay and Australia was going to be shown at Fox and Hounds in Studio City starting at 11 if I could get there. I get there at 11, or it might have been 11:30. I was like, are you going to show the Uruguay-Australia game? Big soccer bar. That's all they do. And they're like, oh gosh, Uruguay-Australia, let me see. Blah, 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 blah. Sure enough, he has it on. I sit in the back corner by myself just watching Uruguay-Australia for no other reason than I've had 2 Australian girlfriends and watch this entire game. And eventually the bar closes, but they leave it open, and it's just like me, the bartender, and a man who appears to be, not to be pejorative, a gangster, and his attractive but perhaps not all that attentive girlfriend as far as the game is concerned. And history was made that night. The John Aloisi. Australia was in for the first time in 70, and no, it wasn't the USA, and so I'm getting us off track. I understand, but like it's an example of the lengths we had to go to watch a hugely important international game. And now it's on your fucking phone, you're on the bus, doesn't matter. Oh, you kids today.
We've all had those experiences, Brendan. Any football fan. I remember even in 94, the Great American World Cup, still the best attended of all time, but it was a World Cup of being there. People went to go to say they'd been to a World Cup game, but all of the games weren't even broadcast on television. The ones I watched in Chicago, I was living then, it would often just be me in a bar with just the barbacks for company and only broadcast on Spanish language television. We really have come so bloody far, so fast. I wrote an essay for ESPN ahead of the 2010 World Cup calling the US men's national team the Dream On team. And I want to acknowledge up top, we do want this so badly to be a world power in football, in soccer, and just as badly, Brendan, the rest of the world loves that we struggle because as the world's sole superpower, us yearning and failing at the one sport that everybody else is kind of born to thrive at, I think it's pretty well the one thing they kind of have over us right now.
And it drives the love on our part all the harder. The thing is, when I was a kid, we had that 1980, hockey team in the Winter Olympics. And people forget that what was great about that team was because they were an underdog. Like, we don't think about that anymore because there's no Olympic sport at which we are not expected to dominate. We were an underdog, and that was amazing. And that felt like that was the part of the American experience. And soccer, men's soccer, is the last frontier almost of underdogdom for us. And it'll be a shame to bring it to an end. What will we lose in that instance? But I bet it'll be worth it. So full speed ahead.
We love underdogs, but we only love winning underdogs because the American mentality really is a winning mentality. We love our teams to play like the original Dream Team's performance at the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, where we crushed the rest of the world without having to pause for a single timeout. And I remember being in a bar in Europe watching that game with hundreds of Americans, and Charles Barkley, Sir Charles, elbowed a hapless Angolan defender in the temple as he dunked on them. I think the US were up about 50 points. I was like, why would you do that? But I was the only one sitting down because every American just jumped on the table and went berserk. We love when we win, and we love when we dominate, and we tend to reclassify sports in which we don't excel as trivial. So that's kind of that's the fight that we've really lived together. Any American soccer fan probably will be nodding at this point.
Well, the conflict there is, nothing spurs sports fandom, especially I think soccer fandom, more than suffering, And we have had, especially on the men's side, more than enough suffering to go around. And so we have, now that people have been paying attention, at least a little bit, since 94, a little bit more since 02, a little bit more since, the Algeria game. And there's only been more suffering. And so this suffering is starting to, form into a critical mass, just waiting to, pour out into joy.
A critical mass of suffering. That is the latest release by my emo band coming out in January. I love that. But the other part of it is that our women are kicking ass, winning trophies, drinking tea while doing so. And our men, to borrow some Langston Hughes, remain a dream deferred. And that reality really masks the truth. I mean, Brendan, at the very first World Cup, 1930, Uruguay, we Americans arrived as seeded favourites. Yes, there were many European countries who declined invitations to participate, but also the semi-professional American Soccer League, which thrived back then since its creation in 1921 by British, German, Scandinavian immigrants up and down the East Coast, gave us this team known affectionately as the shot putters on account of their stocky physiques. And Brendan, we made it to the bloody semi-finals.
Shout out Bird Patenauda, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing his name wrong. I've only ever read it. I've never heard it. But first, World Cup hat trick in history. Then it was such an amazing hat trick, it took him 70 years to get it. But look him up. Bird Patenauda. Again, the pronunciation is a guess.
Oh, Brendan, just dropping knowledge. And I don't understand why we all don't sing like that, like you just did, from the rooftops, baby, and just see ourselves as World Cup semi-final caliber, just by definition of what we achieved in 1930, when we made it all the way to the Final Four, baby, and then got to travel home on a steamship, the SS Monago. What happened right afterwards is actually fascinating. The Pro League fell victim to the Great Depression shortly afterwards, and that had dire consequences for the future of soccer in America because the sport was solely a professional game. It didn't have amateur roots at the collegiate level. And so the sport had no chance to pivot and develop them. And so began its history of decline. But we got to talk about 1950. I have never truly understood why the performance of the United States at this World Cup is not on parallel with the Miracle on Ice, which you mentioned. 1950, World Cup's in Brazil. United States sends a ramshackle team, some of whom weren't even citizens of the United States, part-timers, almost all. Our goalkeeper, Frank Borgi, really a converted minor league baseball catcher. And we had to face, who do we face, Brendan? England.
The alleged greatest team in the world. So good that they didn't even have to prove it with a trophy. Everyone just accepted it. Much as Zeus doesn't wear a crown most of the time, but he's Zeus. And here comes England, who were so cocky. Well, there could be reasons here, but let's go with the legend. They were so cocky that their best player, Stanley Matthews, was golfing. He was just like, "You guys got this. I'm going to be over here doing other stuff.
It's like a proto-Gareth Bale, essentially, but they were favourites for the whole thing. They entered the game really expecting to just treat the Americans like cannon fodder. I think the Americans were 500 to 1. They got in by beating and tying Cuba. They'd lost their 7 previous games by the combined score of 45 to 2, which I love. And the 1-0 victory, I often sit in the dark at home sometimes when I've got moments and try and think about what must have that game been like to witness. Just these huffer-puffer part-timers taking on mighty, slick England, just vaunted England. And so I didn't actually appreciate what it could have looked like until I saw Iceland do England in. In that game I walked away from was like, that must have been what it was like to watch England done in by the United States. It remains one of the greatest upsets in the history of the sport to this day. Think of it, dear listeners, as if like a group of English guys trounced an American all-star team on the baseball diamond, and the two heroes of the game, Haitian-born striker Joe Getchens. Oh, shout out to Joe Getchens.
Big Joe, a dishwasher in New York, gets on the team, makes history.
That's what we all know about him. He was a dishwasher in New York. You're just a dishwasher in New York. A dishwasher in New York. Yes, I am. And I just scored on you a wonder goal. Yes, I am. And I just dunked on you against the run of pay. I just flew in with a header to deflect a shot over the line in the 37th minute. Goalkeeper Bourgie, who then parried every single English shot like some kind of Paleolithic Tim Howard. And God, the three lines really laid siege to the goal for 53 minutes, all for naught. USA 1, England 0. If I ever got a tattoo, that is what it would be. You're in London now, Brendan. Tell me they're still talking about this one, right?
Oh my gosh, they've been quite dour about it. And in fact, I think it recently killed the Queen. So, we have to carry that burden, like a young Peter Parker, great power and all that. These two World Cups, though, and, because, there's not another one for us till 1990, and we're skipping 34 because it was a one and done. They didn't have group stages, people. Get over it. 30, making the semifinal and having the first hat trick is rock solid proof, people. We are in the history of the game. We have history of the game. It has been going on for a very, very long time. We're not as new to this as it can often sound. And 1950 shows us that, again, like the Miracle team, who had a much better movie made about them than this team did, we that bit of America that we like to believe in so much that, we have this belief, that we have this underdog spirit, that, with our just application and verve, we can do absolutely fucking anything, was proven, and particularly it began to show what would become a long history of getting results just because one of our goalkeepers stood on his head. And because we know that can happen, it can always happen in any game we ever play.
God, if you know your history, you know that the past will seek you to the present, please God. By the way, listening to you describe that makes me want to go out and carve statues to Burt Paternow, carve statues to Joe Getchens. My God, we need to bring this history through into the present because it was seismic in a moment. One English newspaper compared the enormity of that loss, not ironically, but they compared the USA 1, England 0 at the World Cup to the loss suffered at Dunkirk. Another ran black borders on every page as just a sign of national mourning. And the American coach, Bill Jeffrey, God bless, proudly announced, "This is all we need to make the game go in the States." I just love that quote.
Oh, bless him. Bless his heart.
How many times have we heard that? Can we, again, the DNA was set for right there and everything around that game. Can we talk about the movie? Have you seen this movie? The movie of 1950?
Yeah.
Is Sudeikis in it?
No, sadly. He could have helped it. It's called The Game of Their Lives. Originally, it has since been changed after Miracle came out, the Herb Brooks, 80 Olympics movie, to The Miracle Match. It is no longer easily findable anywhere on streaming. And it's the Hoosiers guys who put it together. And I saw a preview of it with my SAG card before it came out. And, hey, it's just that if you want to make a movie about a great moment in American history, maybe we don't need noted non-American Gerard Butler playing the goalkeeper.
Not many people will ever get the chance that we're getting today. So let's just make sure of one thing. that after 90 minutes, they know who we are.
I mean, he literally in the movie, I believe it's Reign of Fire, says, "Ugh, Americans." It's not ideal. There's a reason why you don't even see that movie on a plane. But it exists. It exists, and it's semi-factual if you want to check it out. But their portrayal of Joe Gaetron's not very realistic.
Listeners, let's start working on the remake as we speak, but that would prove to be just the first of many false dawns for US soccer. I also love the fact there was just one journalist in attendance, and I believe he was just there on vacation. His name was Den McSkimming of the St. Louis Dispatch. Shout out to Den McSkimming.
What a name.
I know. You can only be an American. What's the name? The name's McSkimming. Den McSkimming. By the way, I'm gifting you that. I do believe one of the great all-time names could be AFC Richmond's next signing, an Irish teenager brimming with talent, but he can't control his temper.
McSkimming! Get in here! I was having a laugh!
Oh my God.
You're always having a laugh, McSkimming! No, coach. I've got scotch in me. I'm going to start doing Irish accents. Let's move on.
Coach, the crack was 100, coach. That's what I'll just keep shouting. But he was there. He was a real person. Den McSkimming. And he tried to send the message of this victory back, but the New York Times believed that the whole thing was a hoax when it came to On the Wire. They buried the story, and the American press virtually ignored the whole bloody thing.
I heard tell that they saw the score coming through the wire on 1-0, and that they thought it was a misprint, and that England had won 10-1. That is the lore that I've had passed down to me about that particular, wire.
Is that how Butler does it in that movie? Is that how he tells it? If Butler says it in that movie, then that must be true. But either way, you imagine today, if we do in 2022 beat England 1-0, there will be a guard of honor at that bloody airport. We will throng wherever they land. There will be just an amazing scene. But back then, the team came back to there was not a Wheatie box, there was not a movie or this crap. I had to wait years for this crap one. It was 1950. It was really, football was just a marginal activity played by immigrant minorities and their kin. The team arrived home without fanfare as anonymously as they left, and the United States would not qualify for the World Cup for another 40 years, and few would care. In the late 60s, interest in American soccer was revived after the 1966 World Cup was televised on tape delay by ABC, which I love, to surprisingly good ratings. Bunch of businessmen saw them, Lamar Hunt, Jack Kent Cooke, thought, hey, we can make a go of this, and started North American Soccer League, NASL, which showcased really a motley crew of homegrown players, handful of low-grade foreign imports, but it all changed when Steve Ross of Warner Brothers brought enough cash to the New York Cosmos to coax the great Pelé himself out of retirement. The Brazilian showered his celebrity on both the club, the sport at large, became the first of a cavalcade of former World Cup stars to parade across the US, Germany's Franz Beckenbauer, the Netherlands' Johan Cruyff, Portugal's Eusebio, and soccer, just thrive flickeringly. It is a boom and bust history, but do you have was this even mildly on the Brendan Hunt radar as a kid?
I knew there was a team called the Chicago Sting. Jerry Reinsdorf actually refers to them with a bit of disdain in the first episode of The Last Dance. So as he says, we were being outdrawn by indoor soccer. But they were an outdoor team and an indoor team. We knew they won a soccer bowl, but it wasn't on TV as far as I could know. And I knew who Pelé was. I would have pronounced it Pele at the time, but I didn't know much of anything. Like New York Cosmos as I guess a brand that penetrated, but I didn't know that Cruyff was around, playing with the Dips and the Aztecs, and that George Best was around. Didn't know any of that. So I knew Pele, knew the Chicago Sting.
Was Pelé just like a kind of Justin Bieber-ish, kind of like Drake, just a character just floating around in the culture?
Yeah, it feels like I remember him being a guest on the Brady Bunch and on the Love Boat and on Fantasy Island, but I don't think he was on any of those. I just remember him being there. Like, he was just kind of around, like, and there's a sport called soccer, and it is represented by this man who's apparently very good.
God, I'm going to be Googling that to find out if Pele ever was a guest on Fantasy Island, because that is must-see television. But one of the hidden details of the NASL that I do love that's not talked about enough, 1983, its penultimate season, I think, US Soccer Federation had a great brainstorm and they decided to enter the national squad into the league as Team America. God, I would cheer for Team America if it was a club team. They wanted to essentially get their players together weekly to sharpen their skills through regular competition, and the effort backfired. The better players refused to leave their original clubs. It was really a humiliating embarrassment. I'm only bringing this up because US Soccer, if you're listening, team actually finished dead last, I believe, in the league. But I think we should resurrect Team America and call it Leeds United. After the NASL's collapse, American Pro Game retreated indoors. Just a rich history, which is really fascinating. Sometimes I find myself going down a wormhole of grainy YouTube videos, watching players like Stan Stamankovic, Preki, and Mark Pulisic. Yes, Christian's dad. And what happened was really, it was ultimately a blessing because the best players, the truly best players, had to go to Europe to play. They went to some wild places. There were players going off to Hungary, Peter Vermes, in California. Paul Caligiuri was a trailblazer signing for Hamburg back in 1987. And the goal he scored against Trinidad qualified the United States for the 1990 World Cup in Italy after a 40-year absence from the international stage. And one of my favourite clips is 34-year-old babyface Bob Lee, a hero, friend of us show.
The great Bob Lee.
The great. I mean, he was for the longest time, the sole out and proud soccer fan at ESPN before it was cool, announcing the achievement really to a bewildered, non-caring American public.
And welcome to SportsCenter. I'm Bob Lee. Minutes from now, prime time with all the National Football League news. We've got football news. We call it soccer. The rest of the world calls it football. And the entire world was watching today as the USA visited Port of Spain, Trinidad, to contest the last spot in the field of 24 for the 1990 World Cup in Italy. It was quite simply the most important soccer match the U.S. has played for the last two generations.
It's so cool that we have that, since so many people missed it and so many people give a shit now. Not just to bask in the glory of a young Bob Lee, but just to get a picture of what it was like back then, this is such a strange moment to look back on, and it's crystallized there.
You can almost tell when we've got football news, we call it soccer, that is a proud football man, aware how much his red meat-eating audience would be hating him, talking about soccer in that instant. And Americans back then, I was in America for the 1990 World Cup. I was shocked to find out how much back then your average sports-loving American, they didn't just care about football. They actively hated it, Brendan.
Yeah, we'd kind of been trained to do that. Like, it was, if you knew anything about soccer, unless you were a soccer person, which, they existed, it was just not your thing. Like, I grew up in Chicago, which, as we say, had a pro soccer team. We love our pro sports, far more pro sports than college sports in Chicago. I went to a high school in the city, Kenwood Academy in Hyde Park, near where the Obamas met, and a mostly black school, and it was with some athletics. We had a football team with some good results at the time, but no one even considered playing soccer. It just never came up. I don't even think in my 6 years there at Kenwood Academy, in 6 years of PE, did I ever once have a soccer unit. Like a couple of weeks where a tired old gym teacher who didn't want to have to do this, but they didn't want to have to do square dancing either. We're like, all right, here's what you're supposed to do. Like it was their job to show us things that they didn't like, but they never even condescended to show us soccer. So soccer became that sport that fucking suburbans were playing. The thing is, I now realize that the face of this is Brian McBride. Brian McBride and I were born like a month apart, but for my hatred, quote unquote hatred at the time of suburbanite soccer players would have been now Brian McBride, who now, of course, I think is a goddamn American hero. But at the time, soccer, those guys who play soccer. But we didn't actually know anyone who played soccer.
And one of my favourite stories is that when America was awarded a World Cup by FIFA, Jack Kemp, the NFL quarterback turned Republican congressman, felt compelled on the floor of make a speech where he said something like, "I think it's important for all those young men out there who someday hope to play real football that a distinction should be made. Football is democratic capitalism, whereas soccer is a European socialist sport." Thank God Stanley Kroenke was not listening to that back in the day. I mean, it was almost like part shame that we were crap. Like, rather than have the rest of the world come and kick our asses, we're going to turn the board over preemptively and tell everyone that we hate it, which was... I mean, we probably hated it even more. Anyone that did watch the 1990 World Cup, our team, mostly college players or few semi-pros, very young John Harkes, Wijnaldum, Casey Keller were utterly smashed in the group stage by Czechoslovakia, beaten by Italy and Austria. I think it was Harkes that once told me they were essentially tourists with really, really good tickets. But they'd accomplished enough to host the next tournament with a modicum of World Cup bona fides and a sense that they belonged. We qualified for that 1994 World Cup by virtue of being hosts. How much was the 1994 World Cup on your radar back then, young Brendan?
Very, very little. Like, I knew it existed, and I think that was by dint of the fact that it started at Soldier Field and it finished at the Rose Bowl. You know, those two hallowed halls gave some gravitas to the event. Enough so that I remember watching the opening match, which was Germany against Bolivia, because at that time the opening match was always the reigning champion, not the host team, which was worse. And I remember in the warm-ups, as the announcers are going out of their way to methodically explain the sport step by step and who these people are, which you wouldn't have had to do to anyone else in the world, because everyone else in the world knew that this blonde person they were highlighting in the warm-ups was a man named Jurgen Klinsmann, who was fairly successful at the thing we call football. But little did I know then that he would loom large in my love of the sport for decades to come. But I do remember thinking, Jurgen Klinsmann. That is the single most German name I could invent or imagine. And I leaned in.
That's so funny because Jurgen had a teammate, Rudi Völler, who had a similar blonde haircut. His was permed and he had like this incredibly foamy moustache. And in probably thousands of miles from where you were watching, Brendan, I felt the same about Rudi Völler. I was just couldn't stop watching those human beings, thinking they are the most German people that have ever Germaned. But I had just arrived in the United States and I had never seen an American footballer before. And that team took the field in their stonewashed denim of shirts, mulleted of hair. And, when I talked to the players, I didn't know this, but yes, with sphincters held tight, desperate to avoid the humiliation of becoming the first home team, unable to emerge from the opening round. And I just watched. I was like, oh my God, these guys are magnificent. In our imaginations, just the face of the team, Alexi Lalas, make ginger great again. By the way, listeners, Alexi Lalas was once a try-hard football player of just deep tenacity and perseverance. Why can't they wear shirts that cool nowadays, Brendan?
Because now we're trying to assimilate into this world of soccer as opposed to just do what we feel like, as opposed to just, hey, John Cougar, what do you think we should wear? A couple questions about all
John Cougar.
First of all,
Cougar. Yeah, John Cougar says it's tie-dye Tuesday. Slap him on, boys.
Rudy Fuller, does he have 2 umlauts or 3? Because that's an impressive amount of umlauts in his name, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, and that was one of his great skills. Just again, tactically confusing his opponents. They stood there befuddled. What? 3 umlauts.
Extra dots
he just got that
everywhere.
That vital inch of space he needed to annihilate them.
You kids today who like your Weston McKinney at all, Alexi Lalas, the first ever American to play for a Serie A team.
Yeah, Padua.
Especially then, and a huge badge of honor. That was when Serie A was the Premier League. These were the days of you're still getting the tail end of Van Basten's career and Rijkaard and that AC Milan team who were just dominating the sport in general. Zidane was just coming into fore, et cetera, et cetera. And again, I didn't know any of this at the time, but I now realize, looking back, having heard this since then, because I wouldn't have known what Serie A was, like, Alexi Lalas, man, damn impressive.
He was impressive. The team were impressive. They managed to scrape through the group stage. We don't really admit that in our historical imagination. They were one of the best third-place teams. That's what they had back then. And they departed in the second round after a hard-fought 1-0 loss to an all-elbows Brazil. They slipped away with their dignity intact, which is more than can be said for midfielder Tab Ramos' skull, which was fractured by an elbow from Brazilian defender Leonardo. Lives were really changed, as you're saying, by that tournament. Balboa told me before the tournament, none of us had clubs to play for. They'd actually trained together, lived together, most of them, for months ahead of that World Cup. And in Balboa's words, he said afterwards, they'd gone from like $10 stipends a day kind of guys to driving fast cars with jet skis on the back. And Lalas, as you say, plucked by Italian minnows, Padua, became the first American player to grace the Serie A in the modern period. Dude was so famous, Brendan. He supported Hootie and the Blowfish on tour in Europe. Doesn't get much more famous than that, does it?
Wow, we're getting John Cougar, we're getting the Hootie and the Blowfish. I mean, this is America coming together.
Hootie and the Blowfish are like, what could we have as an opening act that's worse than we are? And they're like, oh, guys.
About that Brazil game, I did watch that. I remember I watched it. I would have watched it with my dad, actually, which would have been the first and maybe only soccer game we ever watched together. When Leonardo elbowed Tab Ramos, and Tab Ramos' suffering, was immediately clear, if not the fact that he had a broken skull was not yet clear. And thankfully there was a proper red card given. Again, as I said earlier, like, nothing propels fandom more than suffering. And that moment, more than watching the Colombia game, which the Colombia game just confused me. Like, why are we celebrating this goal? We didn't score it. That other guy did on the other team. Why are people going nuts? But an elbow from a man from another country onto the head of a man representing my country just filled me with rage. And it did not, it was not yet enough of a spark to start a fire, but there was a spark there.
Young Brendan Hunt say, we won't forget Brazil. We won't forget. We will have our vengeance.
Oh, Leonardo, we won't be seeing you on Fantasy Island, my friend. I will make sure to that.
By the way, I've just realised if John Cougar did design the US shirt, which, by the way, I want to go on the record and say I think it's a fantastic idea. If you are listening, Mellencamp, he would have our boys rolling out in Qatar wearing white T-shirts with rolled up sleeves and just ciggies just jammed in there, which I think the world will fear.
It's the same sensor that they wear on their the small of their backs, that data bra that they have, just roll it up in the sleeve.
Yeah.
Roll it up in the sleeve. Everybody goes to Tasty Freeze.
Stick your Marlboro Reds in there and shut up, Western. The legacy of the tournament was MLS, but the notion football would catch on immediately, which is really the hope of the architects of the 94 World Cup. Let's just say it's been a slow and steady build. It has happened. It's just taken a little longer. It didn't become the pogo stick. It didn't become the yo-yo, an overnight sensation sweeping the nation. But America's greatest humiliation was self-inflicted in 1998. You didn't really watch this tournament, Brendan, so we are not going to dwell. It didn't really make a dent, did it?
A few things did. But in terms of America, the only game I watched was the Iran game, because to play Iran was, of course, a very loaded affair. And culturally speaking, for soccer to continue to have a bit of drive in the country culturally, we had to beat Iran. And I remember that game starting with a lovely group photo, in front of a sign that probably said peace, unity. There you go.
Yeah, flowers.
And then Iran just beat us fairly easily.
They destroyed it. This was the president called up the US and told them before the game, don't muck things up, guys. And they laughed and were like, we won't. I mean, I made a whole podcast series, American Fiasco, about this campaign. Listeners can catch the whole story of that darkness. But there is something deeply American about it, an approach really not just to football but to life, Brendan, that I love. There's a confidence, really a hubris. Lallis told me on American Fiasco that they're thinking going into 98 where they went in thinking they were going to win the whole bloody thing. They ended up coming rock bottom. I think they scored like once, lost 3. I mean, they were terrible. It was just a disgrace of a campaign. But Lallis told me we went into that tournament thinking this: 1990, we showed the world we could qualify. 1994, we showed the world we belonged. 1998, we were like, let's show the world we can win it all. And there is something truly wonderfully American about that mindset.
That's adorable. You guys. Aww. Forget about
Isn't
it.
that like... I mean, it's like, oh, hey, guys, it's our 3rd tournament of the modern era. It's about time we won it. It's precious. It's amazing. And terrible in equal measure. Subscribe here for more Men in Blazers videos and courage.